This is Mary Cassatt, an American artist born in the 19th century. Although she lived most of her life in France, she was proud of her American roots and, later in her life, was responsible for selecting the works that make up the H.O. Havemeyer collection in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. Although artworks in the Impressionist style weren't well received in the United States during her lifetime, those once derided artworks now hold a beloved place in the American canon thanks to her persistent advocacy. Mary Cassatt was born in Albany, Pennsylvania on May 22, 1844, and was one of 7 children. Her father was Robert Simpson Cassatt, a successful stockbroker and land speculator, and her mother was Catherine Kelso Johnston, who came from a family of bankers. Catherine, in particular, was educated and well-read. Louison Havemeyer, a longtime friend of Cassatt, wrote in her memoirs, "Anyone who's had the privilege of knowing Mary Cassatt's mother would know at once that it was from her and her alone that Mary inherited her ability." Cassatt began formal schooling in Pennsylvania at age 6. As her parents both saw travel as vital to a young person's education, the family removed to Europe, where they lived and traveled for 5 years. She learned to speak German and French during this time. Cassatt turned 11 in 1855, and it's likely that she attended the Paris World Fair that year. This would have been her first exposure to French artists, and no doubt ignited the passion for art that would motivate her for the rest of her life. Despite her parents' objections, Cassatt enrolled in the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in Philadelphia when she was 16. She was determined, even at that young age, to make art her career and to support herself independently with her own work. She didn't remain at the academy for very long, however, and left without a degree after roughly 4 years. Not only was she dissatisfied with the slow pace and narrow focus of instruction, she had no patience for the patronizing attitude of the male students and teachers. The Pennsylvania Academy was a dead end to her goal of independence. After departing the academy, Cassatt moved to Paris in 1866 at the age of 22. If she could not gain serious instruction in the United States, she would study the old masters on her own. She was able to acquire private tutors in France and Spain, and spent a lot of her time at the Louvre in Paris, where she made studies of the artwork on display there. In 1868, when she was 24, Cassatt's painting A Mandolin Player was accepted by the selection jury for the Paris Salon. Cassatt was one of the first 2 American women to exhibit in the Salon, the other being Elizabeth Gardner. Cassatt returned to the United States at the beginning of the Franco-Prussian War in the summer of 1870 when she was 26. While she lived with her family, her father financed her basic needs, but refused to pay for her art supplies. This was a deeply frustrating and discouraging time in Cassatt's life, and she was nearly pushed to give up on art entirely. She was still determined to make an independent living for herself, and if she couldn't support herself with art, then she would figure out something else. Before giving up entirely on her goal of becoming a professional artist, Cassatt moved to Chicago to try her luck there. She, unfortunately, lost some of her works in the Great Chicago Fire in 1871. However, her fortunes turned when she received a commission from Michael Dominic, a Roman Catholic bishop based in Pittsburgh. Dominic financed her travel to Europe, covered some of her living expenses, and paid her to produce copies of a pair of works by Correggio. The following year, Cassatt once again found success in the Paris Salon of 1872, where her painting 2 Women Throwing Flowers at Carnival drew some attention. After completing her commission for the bishop, Cassatt settled permanently in France and set up a studio in Paris. Her sister Lydia came to live with her, and the 2 shared an apartment. Cassatt was an outspoken critic of both the politics of the Salon and of the conventional taste that was favored there. Her traveling companion and fellow artist Emily Sartain wrote of her, "She is entirely too slashing, snubs all modern art, disdains the Salon pictures of Cabanel, Bonnat, all the names we are used to revere." She also, unsurprisingly, had issues with the baked-in sexism of the establishment. Works by female artists were often dismissed with contempt unless that artist had a friend on the jury. Cassatt refused to flirt to curry favor, determined that her paintings would stand on their own merit or not at all. Cassatt was 30 or 31 when she first came across the pastel works of Edgar Degas in 1875. His art was displayed in an art dealer's window and made a powerful impression on her. I used to go and flatten my nose against that window and absorb all I could of his art. It changed my life. I saw art then as I wanted to see it. Cassatt's artwork was accepted and displayed at the Paris Salon every year from 1872 through 1876. Neither of her 1877 entries to the Salon were accepted. This may have been a low point in her career, but she soon discovered an alternative to the rigid and fussy limitations of the Paris Salon. Her work had caught the eye of Edgar Degas, and his admiration for her skill and vision compelled him to invite her to show her works with the Impressionists, who had begun their own shows in 1874. Impressionism, as defined by Wikipedia, was a 19th century art movement characterized by relatively small, thin, yet visible brushstrokes, open composition, emphasis on accurate depiction of light in its changing qualities, ordinary subject matter, unusual visual angles, and inclusion of movement as a crucial element of human perception and experience. Neither Cassatt or Degas liked the term impressionist. They referred to themselves as independents and always maintained the integrity of form in their paintings. Today, a layman's idea of impressionism is typically more in line with the works of Monet and Pissarro, whose artistic focus was on landscapes rather than figures. For a time, however, Cassatt's style did incorporate many aspects of the Impressionist palette of bright colors applied with small brushstrokes. Her insistence on maintaining the forms of her subjects likely saved her from the harsh criticisms received by some of the others in the group. Claude Monet was especially derided during this time. Cassatt's critics merely complained that she painted her figures too realistically to be flattering and that her colors were too bright to be realistic. Cassatt's friendship with Degas lasted for 40 years until his death in 1917. They were each from affluent backgrounds and had similar taste in art and literature. Additionally, neither artist ever married. It is unlikely that the two were lovers, given their conservative social backgrounds and strong moral principles, but there is no definitive proof one way or the other. Degas was always a welcome visitor in the Cassatt household. Cassatt's parents had by this point moved in with her and Lydia, and Degas was in good standing with the whole family. Degas introduced Cassatt to pastels and instructed her in their technique, which she quickly mastered. He also introduced her to etching. The two worked closely together for a while, and her technical skills during this time improved dramatically. Cassatt remained a fixture in the Impressionist circle and participated in their yearly exhibits until 1886, when she was 42. This was also the final year of the Impressionists' exhibits, as by this point the individual aesthetics of each artist had grown and evolved beyond the uniting aesthetic of the group's early days. After 1886, she no longer identified with any art movement, and her style evolved to include many different artistic techniques. In 1890, an exhibition of Japanese artwork was held in Paris. Cassatt was fascinated by the forms and subjects she saw in the woodblock prints. Flat planes and bold lines, skillfully rendered using blocks of color, many of which focused on the lives of women. She quickly created a series of pieces mimicking this style in dry point and aquatint, which were positively received. Her admiration of the Japanese woodblocks would influence her art for the rest of her life. In fact, the 1890s were the most productive years of her career. She painted what is probably her most famous work, The Child's Bath, in 1893. The construction of this piece is what makes it feel so modern. The high horizon line creates a top-down perspective on the figures and brings the highly patterned carpet front and center into the foreground. This flattens the scene in a manner reminiscent of the Japanese woodblock prints. It also creates a sense of intimacy that includes the viewer. The bold stripes of the woman's dress strongly emphasize the forms of both woman and child. The geometric and floral patterns surrounding both figures reinforce the sense of flatness. Parallels of Cassatt's portraits featuring mothers and children are sometimes drawn with the traditional sacred imagery of the Madonna and Child. By replacing the holy iconography with secular and mundane scenes of everyday domesticity, Cassatt elevated the often invisible lives of everyday women. Placed on gallery walls next to dramatic scenes of historical import and mythological grandiosity, Cassatt's beautifully and skillfully rendered portraits more than hold their own. As a genteel woman in the late 19th century, Cassatt's options were limited when it came to locations she could access for subject matter. Cafes, clubs, and even the streets were inappropriate places for a woman of her social class to access. The domestic realm and the theater therefore became her default haunts, and her family members common subjects of her work. It is mainly due to her lack of subjects in other areas of life that she became well known for her paintings of mothers with their young children, as those were the subjects she had most easily to hand. It seems important to note that Cassatt had no desire to have her own children, as she saw the prerequisite marriage and subsequent lifestyle shift as incompatible with her life goals. She painted her mother-child portraits without any particular sentimentality. She was making the most of the subjects she had access to. Also in the 1890s, Cassatt began advising American art collectors, including her good friend Louison Havermeyer and Louison's husband Henry. She facilitated relationships between rich American patrons and some of the Impressionists she maintained contact with, and in this manner brought a wealth of Impressionist art to the United States. "One of the chief pleasures of my life," she wrote in a letter to a collector in 1909, "was to help fine things cross the Atlantic." Cassatt traveled to Egypt with her brother in 1910 when she was 66. The artwork she saw during that trip caused her to doubt her own skill, and that doubt, along with the shock of the sudden death of her brother shortly after they returned home, kept her from painting for almost 2 years. She was able to pick up a brush again in 1912, but was forced to quit for good only 3 years later in 1915, when she was 71. Blinded by diabetes, she lived the remaining 11 years of her life in darkness, deeply bitter that she had been robbed of her greatest joy. Mary Cassatt died on June 14, 1926, at the age of 82. Cassatt's art never gained any particular regard in America during her lifetime, but the beautiful collections of Impressionist work on display at museums across the United States today are the direct result of her purposeful and persistent advocacy. Her legacy is far larger than her own portfolio, though she often doesn't have the credit of it. When I started working on my sketchbook thumbnail, I wanted to get a good, solid handle on Cassatt's face before diving into the actual master study. So I cut in on just that part of the painting and had several attempts to get it right. I struggled with the colors and the form for several hours before reaching the conclusion that what I could achieve with my skills as they are is just going to have to be good enough for now. And then, once I drafted my sketch in my 12x9 block, I realized something. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, my watercolor block is just a smidge smaller than Cassatt's portrait. All of this takes up less room than a 3x3 Post-it. Painting in the Impressionist, or Cassatt's independent style, requires the artist to have a very firm grounding in anatomy, light, contrast, value, and color. As a self-taught artist, I feel like I'm getting there, but if I learned anything from attempting to copy this work, it's that I still have a long way to go. And that's okay. I'm genuinely excited to continue learning and building my skills. Thank you for sticking with me on this quick peek into the life of Mary Cassatt. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like, and if you want to see what I'm working on next, please consider subscribing. I'm heading back to Baroque Italy in 2 weeks to study and talk about Lavinia Fontana. See you next time!